chamber. For I believe we suffer the wrong idea. Somehow tonight, those who plan to vote against this amendment believe that their vote against it is like the passage of the vote for or against a bill that oftentimes comes to the floor. It is not that kind of vote. Article 5 of our Constitution, the very organic document that we attempt to offer out an amendment to tonight, says this very clearly. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose an amendment. So tonight we are not voting on an amendment to pass it or to fail it. We are voting on an amendment to propose it to the citizens of this country to allow them to decide what the organic law of this land will be about. And anyone who suggests tonight that they will stand in opposition to this amendment stands in opposition to the right of the people of their state to say, yes, we support it, or no, we don't. And that is the fundamental issue. And so I ask you to search your soul tonight and decide whether you, as a senator of the United States Senate, are going to stand in the way of the citizens of your state. If you know better than they, if you really have a better vision than the average citizen of this country that supports you and elects you and sends you to this Congress to represent their interest. But in this instance, you are not allowed to do that. You are not allowed to say, I know better. What you can say is, I propose, let us allow tonight the right of the citizens to decide. The Constitution is a basic document. It protects the people's right. And tonight we want to protect the people's right against an overburdening debt structure that has denied this country the kind of economic freedom that all Americans are privileged to. I ask all of you to join with us tonight in proposing to the citizens of this great nation a constitutional amendment for their decision.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I yield 5 minutes to my friend and colleague and the prime co-sponsor of this amendment, the senator from Illinois.
The senator from Illinois.
Madam President and my colleagues, first, let me pay tribute to Senator Byrd, who is a very worthy foe and certainly one of the most distinguished members of this body. I also appreciate the leadership of Senator Hatch on this, Senator Craig, and my colleagues on this side, Senator Heflin, Senator Robb, Senator Mosley Braun, Senator Exon, Senator Campbell, and I should be mentioning others. If we had a proposal in here that said 2 decades after we balance the budget, we're going to have an average increase in income of every American of 36%, we would vote for it overwhelmingly. And yet that's precisely what the General Accounting Office says will happen if we balance the budget in this country. Data Resources, Inc., one of the 2 top econometric forecasters in this country, says if we balance the budget, prime rate will go down 2.5% and an increase in national income of 2%. CBO says at least 1% with a growth in income. The Wharton School in Philadelphia says prime rate will go down 4%. We have an opportunity to do these things that can help our economy immensely. And I hope we don't muff that opportunity. I heard a reference from Senator Byrd to history. It's important to remember that Thomas Jefferson in 1787 said if I could add one amendment to the Constitution, it would be to prohibit the federal government from borrowing. And remember the rallying cry of the American Revolution? Taxation without representation. What are we doing to our grandchildren and generations to come? If that isn't taxation without representation, nothing is. And talk about history. I have not heard one opponent talk about economic history here. I've not read one editorial talking about economic history. The reality is, the history of nations is, when they pile up debt and they get around 9, 10, or 11% of deficit versus national income, they start monetizing the debt. They start the printing presses rolling. And CBO says we're headed for 18%. We can take a chance that we will be the first nation in history to go up to 18% without monetizing the debt, but we're taking a huge, huge gamble. Declaration of Independence. We are making every year, as we add to the deficit, a declaration of dependence. We now owe roughly $800 billion to other countries in our bonds. And if the Simon family gets too deeply into debt, you start losing your independence. And if a nation does, you start losing your independence. Senator Dodd and I are old enough to remember 1956, when three nation friends of ours, Israel, France, and Great Britain, went in and seized the Suez Canal, which President Nasser had taken. They did it because they were our friends, thought they could get by with it, and it was just before an election. And President Eisenhower said, "This is wrong." But something else happened we didn't know about, or most of us didn't know about until some time later. The United States threatened to dump the British pound sterling, and without firing a shot, the troops of Great Britain, France, and Israel withdrew. We're in that situation. Talk about American foreign aid. We now spend twice as much in foreign aid to the wealthy through interest and bonds than we do in foreign economic assistance to poor people. This year, the current estimate is $339 billion on interest, 11 times as much on interest as education, twice as much on interest as all our poverty programs combined, 22 times as much on interest as foreign economic assistance. And it gets worse each year, and it will continue to get worse unless we pass this amendment. If I could have 30 more seconds, I would simply point out, is there going to be pain if we pass this? Yes. But it is very interesting, and the foes of this passed out the Worthlin Amendment, which showed 76% of the population favors this, and 53% said they favor it, but they also believe it's going to cause them pain. The American people are yearning for leadership. And tonight, my friends in the Senate, let's give it to them.
All right.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I yield 2.5 minutes to the distinguished Budget Committee Chairman, Senator Domenici.
Madam President,
The chair recognizes the senator from New Mexico.
I thank the distinguished Chairman, Senator Hatch, for yielding me 2.5 minutes. Madam President, fellow senators, this is a historic night. We have never been so close to putting our nation's fiscal house in order as we will be in 40 minutes. It's on our shoulders, but I can tell you that our children and grandchildren, whether they are present, whether they are listening, whether they are capable of listening or they're too small, they will either thank us tonight for doing something for them, or they will wonder where we were when they needed us most. The truth of the matter is, there are many risks, but the status quo won't work. For those who come to the floor and raise the risks of a balanced budget, the risks of this amendment, they should be asked, what are the risks of doing nothing? I'm convinced that the status quo with reference to fiscal policy for our nation means that the legacy for our children is very close to zero. I want to close by quoting Lawrence Tribe, a very liberal constitutional scholar. He was testifying on the balanced budget, and I asked him whether or not it made sense to do something like this. And listen carefully to what he said. Given the centrality in our revolutionary origins of the precept that there should be no taxation without representation, it seems especially fitting in principle that we seek somehow to tie our hands so we cannot spend our children's legacy. That's the issue. Do we spend our children's legacy, or do we leave a legacy to them? Plain and simple, that's the issue. Thank you for yielding, and I yield the floor.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished senator from Nebraska, the ranking member of the Budget Committee.
The chair recognizes the senator from Nebraska.
I thank my friend and colleague, the manager of the bill. Let me be brief. I just want to say that I have listened to what Senator Simon just said about the debt that continues to consume America. Even if we pass this in the next half hour, which I hope we would urge that we do that, we're still at least 8 years away from beginning to cut down the national debt. That shows how far we're behind the curve. I just wish to say, Madam President, that it's been a real experience in working with the many people on both sides of the aisle. I hope we have the 67 votes in the next few minutes when we cast this historic vote that I think this amendment must be approved. I yield back any remaining time, and I yield the floor.
There is no remaining time. The senator from Utah.
Madam President, as a member of the Senate, I've had the great fortune of voting on many historic bills, but few in the history of the Senate are as significant as this one. It is so rare that we have a vote that so dramatically and directly affects the future for our children and our grandchildren. And this vote is clearly a vote for future generations. This vote is especially significant because of who it will help and who it will hurt. It will help our children and our grandchildren. By removing the onerous burden of debt that we have been accumulating on their shoulders, we are helping to level the generational playing field. It will restore the American dream for another generation of Americans. And who does this vote hurt if we prevail? For starters, the politics as usual crowd, the special interest groups and those with vested interests in the status quo. All those groups who keep feeding at the trough and who think the gravy train will never run out of gas. A balanced budget means no more pork for the special interests. And while I'm at it, I want to give the special interests and those with vested interests in the status quo one piece of advice. Pack your bags and hit the road. The show is over. And do you know who else is hurt by the balanced budget amendment? You may find this hard to believe. Everyone in this chamber. Gone are the days when politicians can take the easy way out. Gone are the days when politicians can say, pass it, we'll worry about it and pay for it later. We can no longer pass anything that we can't come up with the money for. It's called accountability, and it starts right here, right now. That's why I'm so proud to have been a part of this debate. Now, when I see my grandchildren, I can look them in the eye and tell them, today marks a new beginning in their lives. And I can smile knowing that when it comes time for them to go to college, to train for a career, to buy a house, to raise a family, they'll be able to do so. The American dream will live on for another generation. The President of the United States, I have a caution for him. Mr. President, you have joined forces with the special interests. And let me ask you one simple question. How can you look your daughter Chelsea in the eye after what you're trying to do here? How can you justify the trillions of dollars of red ink that you and others who are voting against this have subjected the American children for? Over the next several months, we will be working late into the evening, examining every single line of the federal budget, searching for waste, fraud, and abuse, cutting programs that have outlived their usefulness, and finding the money for those who still work, and it will all be worth it. For our grandchildren, it is worth it. And Madam President, I want to thank everybody who has participated. I want to pay tribute to the distinguished senator from West Virginia and for the dignified manner in which he's conducted his opposition to this. I want to pay great tribute to my friend from Illinois and to my friend from Idaho and all the others who have worked so hard on this floor, especially those 11 brand new senators. They have made a real difference here. And they've shown us that this is the new way. This is what we've got to do. We have to have a future for our children and grandchildren. We can no longer afford to spend this country into bankruptcy. And I want to thank all of the loyal and dedicated staff people and those who have worked so hard, and above all those who will vote for this amendment this evening. I urge my colleagues to vote for it. Our very lives depend on it. The salvation of this country depends on it. The future of our children depends on it. And I think it's one of the most important votes we'll ever cast.
The chair now recognizes the Democratic leader who has the next 15 minutes.
Madam President, this has been a good debate. It's been a long and historic debate. But it has not been a debate about a balanced budget. No one supports the current debt or deficit. Every senator believes, as I believe, that deficit spending must end. We've heard the figures. We've debated how we got to this point. We've noted all of our efforts so far. And I've not heard anyone argue for doing nothing. The debate has been how we achieve what we all say we want, and over what time period, and whether or not, in order to accomplish what we say we all want, we amend the Constitution for the 28th time. During this debate, we have heard many who have argued eloquently that there is no purpose in amending the Constitution for this reason. Our colleague, the senior senator from New York, emphasizes over and over again that while one machine can do the work of 100 men and women, no machine can replace the need to take fundamental responsibility. No provision in the Constitution can create a formula for automatic deficit reduction. Nothing we do here will embolden us to make decisions which we are otherwise unable to make for ourselves. This debate has also underscored the role the federal government plays within our economy. No one can deny that fiscal policy has moderated the extraordinary consequences of a deep recession. This counter-cyclical strategy employed since World War II has had profoundly positive consequences in the economy during our lifetimes. We've seen them. We've seen the charts. We've seen all of the arguments made on the other side, and nothing will persuade me that the fiscal policy initiated since World War II has had the desired result. Many who will vote no today will do so out of legitimate fear that our ability to counter the economy will be severely jeopardized with the passage of this amendment. And there are also many who believe the fiscal policy should never be written into the Constitution because it doesn't belong there. They have argued, like the thousands of other amendments proposed in 200 years, this too should be defeated. Many of us have listened to the logic of many of these arguments and appreciate each and every one. Many of us have also decided that the time has come, that the question of a constitutional amendment is before us for good reason. But we also question the wisdom of the amendment that is now presented to us. And we're deeply troubled by the attitude of many of our Republican colleagues that you take this amendment or you don't take any amendment at all. We're troubled really for three reasons. First, it is our belief that this ought to be our very best effort. We can't come back later as we can with statutes. We can't come back later and say if we could only change that phrase or that paragraph or even that word. That's not something we do with the Constitution. We have to admit that we've made mistakes in drafting, and if we have, we're going to have to live with them for all time. This is going to be with us a long, long time. Even the Prohibition Amendment was with us for 13 years, long after we came to the conclusion that it too was a mistake. Secondly, this debate has been politicized, unfortunately. The RNC has used this debate as a membership drive. In fact, in my state of South Dakota, they're interrupting ads with programs. There's so many these days. The practical ramifications of this amendment as well, as currently drafted, are profound, and we ought to realize that. We ought to understand the ramifications of this particular language. Regardless of how we view the constitutional amendment itself, let us look at this language. Let us examine this draft and ask each and every one, are we prepared tonight to put it into the United States Constitution? This amendment could pass by 70 votes, yet it will fail perhaps by 2 tonight. Why? Not because 2/3 of a majority opposes the concept of a balanced budget amendment. I'm sure that 2/3 and more support it. But because we have a grave concern about the specific draft our Republican colleagues tonight insist upon. a draft which is filled with promise but devoid of details. That was the reason I offered many weeks ago the Right to Know Amendment, requiring that we spell out the details, insisting that we know how we get from here to there, recognizing the importance of a blueprint, of a glide path, knowing that if you can't build a house without a blueprint, you can't balance the budget either. Today, the chairman of the Finance Committee indicated that Medicare and Medicaid may be cut by $400 billion over the course of the next several years. Well, this is a detail that happens to be very important to us, that we recognize may be a part of the mix, but if we're not willing to spell it out, if we're not willing to put on paper the details, then indeed I think we're asking for a pig in the poke, and we're asking for it in the United States Constitution. The Republicans promise, even though they're unwilling to spell it out, to leave Social Security untouched. But while they argue we need to put a requirement into the balanced budget, or a balanced budget requirement into the Constitution for purposes of certainty, they're unwilling to do so for Social Security. Without the promise in writing, we cannot require future Congresses to comply with our expectations. I will predict tonight, if this amendment passes, that the Social Security Trust Fund will be used. And that's wrong. The American people oppose it. We have made a commitment to them now for over 60 years. We compound the deficit reduction problem, and we mask the size of the deficit. But we invite the cynicism of the American people all over again. If we're prepared to reduce the deficit using Social Security trust funds, what confidence do they have in us with any future decision after we've made the commitment that has stood for this long? In my view, the amendment is also especially lacking when it comes to enforcement and the role of the courts. Something this important should not be unresolved in spite of the best efforts of the senior senator from Georgia. As written, it is very likely we will see a constitutional crisis as Congress and the courts face off on the very question of jurisdiction in the years ahead. It is also unfortunate that the federal government cannot be allowed to function budgetarily like everyone else. We shouldn't treat investment and operating costs alike, and yet that is exactly what we will require as a result of the actions taken in this body now for the last several weeks. No one does that at any level of government. No one does that in business. No one does that in their family budgeting. We shouldn't do it either. And yet tonight, by the action taken on this amendment, we will be, if indeed the amendment passes, requiring the federal government to do something no one else does. Madam President, the bottom line, regardless of whether we're talking about Social Security, a capital budget, the right to know, enforcement, or any one of a number of the issues that we have raised for the last several weeks, the bottom line is this: we can do better. This is not the best we can do. This is a shoot now, ask later approach, and we will regret it. That could destroy the very fabric upon which this nation was built. And I just hope, that we all come to the realization of what the stakes are as we cast our vote tonight. It is, as others have said, one of the most critical votes we will cast. A vote which could change not only the budget, but the economy and the perception of the very Constitution itself. Let us take care to do it right. Let us defeat this amendment, go back to the drawing board before it's too late. Future generations are counting upon us tonight to do just that. I retain the balance of my time and yield the floor.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the distinguished Senate Majority Leader.
Do I understand the Democratic leader retain the balance of his time? Are there additional requests?
Madam President, I was anticipating others who may ask for time, but if there is no other request for time, I'd yield it back.
Is the senator yielding back his
I'll yield back
time?
the balance of my time.
The Senate Majority Leader is recognized for 15 minutes.
Mr. President, the senator from South Dakota had asked earlier for 1 minute, which I'm prepared to allow it, but not all asking him to consent. He may enter a statement in the record at this point. Senator Pressler.
Without objection, so ordered.
Let me, just for those who follow this debate, We've had 19 days of consideration. We've had 115 hours and 54 minutes of debate. That doesn't include votes or quorum calls or morning business, where a lot of the morning business was directed at the balanced budget amendment. So we've had a lot of debate, and just say that for the record for some who think maybe we haven't been on this long enough. My view is we're down to about one vote. One vote. Maybe it's 68, maybe it's 66. And I think we do stand at the crossroads in American history. I think this vote is one of the most important many of us will have cast in decades, because now we have an opportunity to do it, and we haven't had that opportunity before. In fact, this may be the single most important vote we cast in our careers. And I would say at the outset, and I think the figures I quoted indicate we don't take amending the Constitution lightly. It's certainly been considered at length. Everybody's had an opportunity to say about everything they wanted to say. And I think we also must understand that there was never a more serious time when Washington needed the discipline, when Congress needed the discipline that the Constitution, and only the Constitution, can impose. Now, we've heard a lot of talk about laws that were passed, and we've passed, since 1969, the last time we passed a balanced budget amendment, or passed a balanced federal budget, we passed 7 different laws containing balanced budget requirements, and despite all the speeches and the good intentions and everything else that went with it over the past quarter of a century, the federal debt has grown each year and every year. And why is it so important to balance the budget? Well, there are probably a lot of reasons been stated on this floor. People who oppose and people who support the balanced budget amendment tell you, oh, it's important to balance the budget, and maybe even important to vote for the balanced budget amendment if you're in a tough race for re-election. But in 1969, the American taxpayers paid $12.7 billion for interest on the national debt. This year, interest on the national debt will devour a staggering $234 billion, and more than all the government spent on agriculture, crime fighting, veterans, space and technology, infrastructure, natural resources, the environment, education, and training combined. All of that and more was spent on interest on the debt. And we've gone through this debate where some are trying to scare America's senior citizens, and that by doing what we hope we can do in about 20 minutes here, by passing a constitutional amendment with 67 votes, we take the opposite view, that we're protecting the very programs that where we try to scare seniors, whether it's Medicare or Social Security. And what they fail to mention is the national debt threatens every program. Every program is threatened. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, agriculture, nutrition programs, you name it. If the debt continues to escalate, as it will, and each year interest payments are going to be larger and larger and consume more and more of its share of the federal dollar. And according to President Clinton's budget, interest on the debt is going to consume 16% of every federal dollar. And anyone who's still not convinced need look no further than President Clinton's recent budget, which essentially gave up on ever balancing the budget and ever balancing the nation's books. In 1992, candidate Clinton seized on the $292 billion deficit, the highest in history. And he campaigned against the deficit. He was successful. He agreed to cut it in half. Now, 2 years into his administration, his own budget abandons the pledge, predicting a deficit of $196.7 billion next year and roughly $200 billion a year through the year 2000. In each of the next 5 years, the amount the federal government collects in taxes is projected to rise, but spending will go up much more. The picture only gets worse in the next century. when the deficit is projected to rise to $421 billion, $421 billion by the year 2005. So we're not going to have the deficit, we're going to double it. We're going to double it if we fail to take action in the next few moments. I think the time has come. If there was any message last November, and different people heard different messages, and some didn't hear any message at all, and some are here, and some will be voting. There was a revolution last November. The American people said, stop, wait a minute. We want less government. We want to rein in government. We want to dust off the 10th Amendment. We want to return power to the states and power to the people. And one way to do that is to rein in federal spending and not increase federal taxes. So the American people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, voters generally sent us a message. I'm not certain what the precise message was, but I think the general message was, as I stated, rein in the federal government. And I believe the adoption of this amendment is a big step in that effort. If we're ever going to rein in the federal government, rein in spending, we need help. We don't have the will in this body to do it. Oh, I've heard all the speeches, then I've checked the voting records, and they don't match. Oh, I hear speeches at night when I can't sleep. People on the Senate floor, all we got to do is make these tough decisions. But then when the tough decision comes, oh, that's too tough, or it's not tough enough, or any other excuse to duck. We can't wait for statutory change. We can't count on them. They haven't worked, as I said, since 1969. I think the American people want us to stand up to the special interests, and they want us to do the right thing. And many say, oh, well, this is the easy way out. You all voted for the balanced budget amendment. Then you go out and say, well, I voted for the balanced budget amendment. And you continue to vote for all the spending programs. I don't think so. My view is if we adopt this amendment and 3/4 of the states ratify it, it's going to fundamentally change the way we do business in the Congress and all over Washington. So this is an amendment whose time has come, and as Thomas Jefferson said in 1789, and I quote, "The question whether one generation has the right to bind another by the deficit it imposes is a question of such consequence as to place it among the fundamental principles of government. We should consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debts, morally bound to pay them ourselves." End of quote. Now, if you think about that for a moment, this was just 1 year after the new Constitution went into effect. Thomas Jefferson himself was pondering whether a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget was needed. So, Madam President, the time for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution has come. Since we had our first Constitution in 1788, went into effect in 1788, a total of 27 amendments have been adopted. The first 10, commonly referred to as the Bill of Rights, made the United States a model for the world by limiting the powers of government and securing rights for individuals and states. The Bill of Rights was proposed to the legislatures of the several states by the first Congress on September 25, 1789, and ratified by December 15, 1791. And I think there's a common thread that runs through all the amendments that have been adopted. Whether it's the first 10, the Bill of Rights, there's a common thread. Most have either limited the power of government or provided constitutional protection to groups of Americans. And I believe the balanced budget amendment would do both. By limiting the federal government's ability to borrow, it will help provide constitutional protection to future generations of Americans and those who aren't adequately represented in our current system. Nobody's contacted me on behalf of the 5-year-olds or the 10-year-olds or the 15-year-olds and about their future. Nobody lobbying for them. They're waiting for us. And I don't believe we can continue to mortgage America's future. If we continue current tax and spending policies, we're going to saddle that future generation with a lifetime tax rates, effective rates of more than 80%. So if we want to take away representation of our children and our grandchildren, We want to take away the discipline. We want to have it one way in an election year and another way in the next year, and then we can vote against the balanced budget amendment. But as I look around the chamber, I see Democrats and Republicans saying, wait a minute, it's time we act. This is a bipartisan effort. We need Democrats and Republicans to make this happen. And it's not going to happen unless it's bipartisan. You know, we also took an oath of office. Support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I consider the rising debt and the interest rates to be sort of a domestic foreign enemy, in a sense, a domestic enemy. And I think that simple oath illustrates why the balanced budget amendment is so important. We haven't been successful in the past. We haven't balanced the budget in the past because the federal budget never became a national priority. And if you want to make it a national priority, we adopt the balanced budget amendment and say we're going to have a balanced budget by the year 2002. And that makes it clear to everyone in this body that balancing the budget is not only a national priority, but also a constitutional duty. And that every senator will be sworn to uphold and defend this amendment to the Constitution. That's the way it works. It's the way it should work. So we've had a healthy debate, as I've said, 115 hours or 116 hours plus a lot of other morning business hours. I certainly want to commend my colleague, Senator Hatch, who's been on this floor day after day after day, and my colleague, Senator Craig, who every morning in my office has had a meeting with a group to work on the balanced budget amendment, try to find out what we need to address, how we can pick up one more vote. And if anybody ever questioned anybody's motives, you cannot question the motives of the senator from Illinois, Senator Simon. He's been for the balanced budget as long as I've known him. He could go any way he wants. He's not running again. This isn't politics to Paul Simon. This is a commitment he's made to the people of Illinois and a commitment he's made to his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So I appreciate the efforts made by my friend from Illinois. And certainly the senator from West Virginia deserves our thanks. Hopefully not overdo that, but we deserve our thanks. You've made a great contribution to the debate. In fact, I've been saying around the country that Senator Byrd is the expert, and I say it with admiration. He's a master of the game, and he also understands Roman history. At least he understands it better than the rest of us, because we never question what he says about Roman history. I'm trying to get C-SPAN to give college credit for those who watch it around the country. And it would be deserved, because the senator from West Virginia does understand it. And certainly he's contributed to this debate. And let me just have the last word. I think everybody has said out here from time to time the Constitution is a living document. And that's why it includes Article 5, which outlines a process for proposing and ratifying constitutional amendments. But they didn't make, the Founding Fathers didn't make amending the Constitution easy. And the action we take today, if we succeed, is not the last word. And if we fail, it's not the last word. Because the final word on whether or not there's going to be a balanced budget goes outside Washington, goes away from this body, and out to our respective states. And I would say to those who are still maybe haven't quite decided which way to go, and there may be 2 or 3 of those, maybe 4. Maybe you're not quite certain, but certainly you have some confidence in your state legislature, wherever it may be. Why not give them a chance? It takes 3/4 of states to ratify. Why not say that we have some confidence in people who live in our respective states and deal on a daily basis with problems that affect our constituents too? Because the Founding Fathers said in the final analysis it's going to be determined by the people who are, by those who are closest to the people. And those are the men and women who serve in state houses around the country. And I think we ought to remember that as we vote. The Founding Fathers didn't put the final authority in the hands of Congress. They put it in the people, members, men and women, state legislatures are closest to the people. So I would remind my colleagues as we prepare to vote here just a few facts. I think many senators referred to these earlier. Depending on which poll you use, and polls change from time to time, about 80% of the American people favor the balanced budget amendment. Now, maybe 80% are wrong and the 20% are right. This has happened in the past. But these polls have been consistent, 71, 75, 78, 81, somewhere between 75 and 80%. 300 members of the other body voted for a balanced budget amendment, 72 Democrats and 228 Republicans. They joined together to give us this historic opportunity. And I'd state what every member already knows, that adopting this amendment, if it's adopted, is only the first step in securing our nation's financial future. Whatever happens, we're going to have to make difficult choices. Republicans will begin work on a detailed 5-year plan to put the budget on a path to balance by the year 2002. And our plan will not raise taxes. Our plan will not touch Social Security. Everything else, from agricultural to zebra mussel research, will be on the table. So, Madam President, as George Washington reminded us in his farewell address, and I quote, "The basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government." End of quote. The time has come for us to exercise that right. So I would just say, let's get prepared for this fundamental change. It's going to come. If not tonight, it'll come maybe next month or the next month or next year. It's not going to be business as usual in Washington. So I would just urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment. Take 67 of us, send it back to the states for ratification. Let those closest to the people then decide if we spelled out how we'll reach the balanced budget amendment. Let's not take that judgment away from them. I'd ask that my entire statement made it part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Abraham. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Ashcroft. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Biden. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Bradley, Mr. Breaux, Mr. Burns, Mr. Bryan, Mr. Bumpers, Mr. Burns, Mr. Byrd. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coverdale. Mr. Craig. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. Craig. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. Daschle. Mr. DeWine. Mr. Dodd. Mr. Dole. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Exon. Mr. Feingold. Mrs. Feinstein.
Come to order. The Majority Leader.
Madam President, I move the Senate stand at recess till 10 a.m. Wednesday, March 1st. I'd ask that further proceeding of the quorum call be rescinded.
Okay, without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, before the senator makes his motion, would he explain to the Senate why we're going out and why we're not having a vote, as we all anticipated that we would be having a vote?
Well, let me explain to my friend from West Virginia. We still think there's some chance of getting this resolved by tomorrow morning so that we'll have 67 votes, or maybe more. We've been on this now for 115 hours, I don't know how many days. Everybody's had a right to debate. We're up to the critical time of the vote, and this senator wants to make every effort he can to see if we can reach the 67 votes. If we fail, we'll fail. It'll be some 10 o'clock or some between 10 and noon tomorrow morning. So I would renew the motion.
Mr. President, would the senator allow me 5 minutes before he makes that motion? But I ask unanimous consent.
Does the chair hear any objections?
No.
If not, the senator may proceed.
Madam President, I thank the distinguished Majority Leader for allowing me to have this privilege to address this question before he makes the motion to adjourn. Madam President, would senators please be seated?
The senator makes a point. Would everyone take their seats?
Madam President, I think this is a sad spectacle. We've had 30 days of debate. Both sides have poured out their hearts, have worked hard, and we came to the moment that we thought we were going to have a roll call vote. we entered into an agreement to that effect. Now, if we had known that we were going to reach this kind of a travesty, this senator would never have agreed to that unanimous consent agreement. And it may be hard to enter into agreements hereafter. Madam President, the framers intended that before the people at the state level have an opportunity to ratify a constitutional amendment, that it should be approved by both houses of the Congress by a 2/3 vote. And it was here that the amendment was supposed to be probed and examined and carefully studied before it was sent on its way to the states. Now here's what we see. We see the sad spectacle of senators on the other side trying to go over until tomorrow in order to get another vote for this amendment. It should be obvious to everyone that the main object here is to get that vote, as the distinguished majority leader said. And so it boils down to an insatiable desire to get a vote for victory. We're tampering with the Constitution of the United States. This is no place for deal-making, backroom huddles. No wonder the people have such a low estimation of the Congress. Going to make deals in the back rooms. And I don't imply by what I'm saying, I don't want to cast any aversions on any senator in particular, but this is a process. We've worked our way through it. We were told there'd be a vote. We've waited on the vote. Up here, the press is gathered. They want to see the outcome of this action, of this debate.
Chair will remind those occupants in the galleries that there will be no expressions of approval or disapproval.
Madam President, this has every appearance of a sleazy, tawdry effort to win a victory at the cost of a constitutional amendment, at the cost of amending the Constitution of the United States. We've had our chances. Why don't we vote? I hope we'll vote, Madam President. Let's don't wait until tomorrow. Now is the time for the decision. That's what we were told. I deplore this tawdry effort here to go over to tomorrow so that additional pressures can be made on some poor member in the effort to get his vote. Laugh if you must. Laugh. This is no laughing matter. We're talking about the Constitution of the United States. We were ready for a vote. Obviously, the proponents on the other side felt that they were going to lose. We can't win them all. We can't lose them all here. But I think it's a sad day for the United States Senate. If this is the way we're going to go about amending the Constitution of the United States, I think the distinguished senator, I hope we will vote tonight.
Well, I'd ask that I
Senate
make
Majority Leader.
5 minutes to respond.
Without objection,
then I'm going to make
ordered.
the motion. You know, this is probably, as I said in my statement, the most important vote we're going to cast around here, maybe in our careers. And we don't take amending the Constitution lightly. But to suggest that somehow this is unprecedented, tawdry, whatever, in my view, is out of bounds. We have every right to use the rules to determine if we have the votes or if we can pick up votes. And I intend to do that. We've been on this amendment 115 hours plus 20-some hours, quorum calls, votes. Nobody complained about that. And what about the 80% of the American people Do you think they care whether we vote at 7 or 7:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning? 80% who want this amendment passed? Do you think they feel as the Senator of West Virginia feels? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, we have some obligation to ourselves, obviously, and nobody's trying to put the arm on anybody around here. We haven't made house calls. We haven't knocked on the doors. We haven't gone to their offices. But we have good faith negotiations we're going, and maybe they've ended. That's fine if they've ended. There's still other options. So I just suggest, Madam Chairman, this is an important vote. If I thought there was one more vote tomorrow morning, or 2 more votes, or 3 more votes, or next week, I'd make every effort I could to secure those votes, just as the distinguished Senator of West Virginia has done time after time after time in this body. I think the sad spectacle is that we may lose this vote, whether it's tonight, it's not going to be tonight, whether it's tomorrow or later. Where people who voted for the amendment before their election vote against it after their election. What do the American people think? What do the American people think about any of us in this body? They sent us a loud and clear message last November. And as I said, nobody knows what the precise message was, but generally it was to rein in the federal government, to give power back to the people and back to the states, and that's what this amendment does. So in my view, by postponing this vote, we'll attempt to reflect the will of 76 to 80% of the American people and not the will of 20%. And we may fail this time. I quoted earlier statements of Jefferson and Washington, who had little knowledge about what the Founding Fathers had in mind, and who suggested themselves that we might come a time we'd have to amend the Constitution and wouldn't pile up the debt on the next generation as we continue to do. And I want to commend again those who've worked on both sides. Yeah, this has been bipartisan, and it should be, and it still can be. And I know the President's very strongly opposed the balanced budget amendment. I know he's called members. I know what happens when your President calls. We've gone through it on this side. It puts a lot of pressure on a senator or a member of Congress. We've tried to improve the condition by accepting or agreeing to an amendment offered by the distinguished senator from Georgia, Senator Nunn. And I would just hope that all of us would think about this overnight. Some may decide to vote the other way. We take a gamble by waiting till morning. We might lose a vote. But in my view, the gamble is worth taking. The risk is worth taking. And I know the Senate of West Virginia...
Would distinguished leader yield for a question?
No, I'm not going to yield for a question. I know the Senator of West Virginia feels strongly about this amendment. He has every right to feel strongly about it. Doesn't mean he's right. He might be wrong. We may be right. And if we can't determine that tonight or tomorrow night, we'll determine it the next time the voters have a chance to speak. So I move the Senate stand in recess till 10 a.m. Wednesday, March 1st.
The question is on the motion to recess. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. It appears that the ayes have it. The motion to recess is agreed to. The Senate will stand in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow.